"Cowboy, don't look, my dress is gone." The words came from behind the waterfall, barely audible over rushing water. Jake Brennan froze, hand on his gun, every instinct screaming danger. He was 3 days deep into Apache territory, alone, tracking stolen cattle that might cost him his life. Now this, an Apache woman's voice, desperate and vulnerable, calling from behind the falls. One wrong move, and he'd be dead before sunset. One right move, and he'd violate every code of honor he'd ever known. The canyon walls pressed close, heat shimmering off red sandstone. Behind that waterfall, someone needed help, and Jake had to decide right now what kind of man he truly was. The Arizona sun hung merciless overhead as Jake Brennan dismounted near the canyon's edge, studying the muddy ground with practiced eyes. 3 days tracking stolen cattle had led him deeper into Apache territory than any sensible man would venture alone. The hoofprints were fresh, but something else caught his attention. Unusual watermarks streaking down the canyon walls, evidence of yesterday's flash flood that had torn through the narrow gorge with devastating fury. Jake was 32, weathered beyond his years, with sun-creased eyes that had witnessed both the brutality and beauty of frontier life. He'd worked ranches from Montana to Mexico, earning respect through honesty and hard work rather than the gun holstered at his hip. The cattle he tracked belonged to the Henderson Ranch, where he'd been foreman for 2 years, long enough to call it home, short enough to remember he'd always been a drifter. The canyon stretched before him, walls of red sandstone carved by centuries of water into smooth serpentine curves. Cottonwood trees clustered near a waterfall that cascaded over limestone rocks, their leaves rustling in the hot breeze. The peaceful scene contradicted the violence written in the landscape. Uprooted brush, scattered debris lodged in tree branches 15 feet high, the raw smell of disturbed earth. Then he heard it. A voice, feminine and strained, calling from somewhere near the waterfall. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his revolver before he caught himself. The voice called again, speaking words he couldn't understand. Apache, he realized, the rhythmic cadence unmistakable. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed danger, but the desperation in that voice transcended language. "Hello?" Jake called toward the falls, his voice echoing off canyon walls. "You need help?" A pause stretched long enough that he wondered if he'd imagined it. Then, "Yes, please." The English was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen. "Behind the water, I am trapped." Jake approached the waterfall cautiously, boots slipping on wet rocks as spray misted his face. Behind the cascading water, he could make out a small alcove carved into the canyon wall. A figure huddled there, barely visible through the liquid curtain. "Can you come out?" he asked, maintaining a respectful distance. "No." The woman's voice carried shame and frustration. The flood. It took everything, my clothes, my belongings. I was bathing upstream when the water came. "I barely made it here." A pause, then quietly, "Cowboy, don't look. My dress is gone." Jake felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. He turned his back to the falls, staring determinedly at the canyon wall opposite. "I'm Jake Brennan, ma'am. I mean no disrespect. How long you been trapped?" "Since yesterday afternoon. I am Narlin." Her voice was steadier now, assessing him. "You are far from the settlements." "Why?" "Tracking stolen cattle. Henderson Ranch." Jake shifted his weight, acutely aware of the absurdity of making small talk while a woman hid naked behind a waterfall. "Listen, Miss Narlin. Sun's gonna set in few hours. Temperature drops fast in these canyons. You can't stay there all night." "I know." The admission cost her pride. He heard it in her voice. "But I cannot walk through this country with nothing. The shame—" Jake understood. Not just personal modesty, though that was considerable, but tribal dignity, cultural honor. For an Apache woman to be found in such a state by a white cowboy represented a vulnerability that transcended physical danger. "I got a bedroll," Jake offered, still facing away. "It's dusty and probably smells like horse, but it's whole. I could leave it on the rocks here, back away, let you make something from it." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the waterfall's constant rush. Jake could almost feel her weighing the offer, calculating risks, measuring his trustworthiness by the tone of his voice alone. "Why would you help me?" Nalin asked finally. "Your people and mine. There is much blood between us." Jake thought about the question, about the easy answers and the true ones. "Because you need help," he said simply. "And because maybe it's time somebody did something different than what's been done before." The practical challenges proved more complex than Jake anticipated. His bedroll, when spread on the rocks, was barely 6 feet of canvas and wool, enough for sleeping, inadequate for clothing. Nalin studied it from behind the falls, calculating, problem-solving. "Do you have a knife?" she called. Jake placed his Bowie knife beside the bedroll and retreated 20 paces, positioning himself with his back to a cottonwood tree. He heard splashing as Nalin emerged, the quick rustle of canvas being cut and arranged. Minutes passed. The sun crept lower, painting canyon walls in amber and rust. "You may turn now," Nalin said. Jake turned slowly. She stood near the waterfall, having fashioned the bedroll into a practical dress that fell to mid-calf, secured at the shoulders and waist with strips of canvas. Her black hair, still damp, hung past her shoulders. She was perhaps 25, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that assessed him with equal parts wariness and curiosity. "That's right clever," Jake said, keeping his voice neutral and respectful. "My grandmother taught me that survival requires adaptability." Nalin's English was remarkably good. "I was gathering medicinal plants when the flood came." The sky was shifting toward evening, clouds building to the east. Jake recognized the signs. More rain coming, possibly another flash flood. "We need to get to higher ground. There's an overhang about half-mile up I passed. We can shelter there." "We?" Nalin's eyebrow raised slightly. "Well, I can't leave you here, and you can't make it back to your people before dark in bare feet across this terrain." Jake met her eyes directly. "I give you my word, my protection, nothing more. Tomorrow morning, I'll help you get home safe." Nalin studied him for a long moment. Whatever she saw must have satisfied something, because she nodded once, sharply. "Your word means something to you?" "It's about all I got that does," Jake answered honestly. They began walking, Jake leading, setting a careful pace. He couldn't help noticing how she moved, gracefully despite injuries, reading the landscape with practiced ease. She belonged to this country in ways he never would. "The cattle you track," Nalin said as they climbed. "They were not taken by Apache." "How do you know?" "Because Apache would not leave tracks pointing to Apache territory. We are not stupid, whatever your newspapers claim." Jake laughed despite himself. "Fair point." The overhang, Jake remembered, offered better shelter than expected, a deep alcove in the canyon wall with a sandy floor and ancient pictographs decorating the back wall, spiral symbols and handprints that predated all living memory. They had perhaps an hour of light remaining. Jake gathered deadwood, while Nalin collected tinder for kindling. They worked in practiced silence, two people who understood wilderness survival instinctively. When Jake sparked his flint to steel, the fire caught quickly, warm light pushing back the gathering darkness. Thunder rumbled. Rain began as scattered drops, then intensified into a downpour that created a silver curtain across the overhang's entrance. Jake checked his provisions: hardtack, jerky, coffee. He offered half to Nalin, who accepted with a nod of thanks. "You've been educated," Jake observed. "Your English is better than half the men I ride with." "Mission school at Fort Apache when I was young." Nalin's expression was unreadable in the firelight. "The teachers wanted to civilize us, but my grandmother was clever. She said, learn their words, but never forget yours. Knowledge is never wasted, even if it comes from those who misunderstand you. Smart woman. She was. Nalin's voice softened. She died last winter. The medicines I was gathering, I was trying to remember everything she taught me, so that knowledge would not die too. Jake understood loss. My parents died when I was 14. Cholera, both of them, within 3 days. I've been on my own since, working ranches, moving on when the mood struck. Why? Nalin asked. Easier to leave than to let people see who you really are, I suppose. Easier to be alone than risk mattering. That is not strength. That is fear. The bluntness struck Jake like a slap, but he couldn't argue. You're right. Outside, lightning split the sky, thunder following instantly. Rain came in wind-driven sheets, and Jake knew the canyon below was flooding again. They were trapped here until morning. I was afraid today, Nalin admitted quietly, when I heard your voice this morning and did not know if you were friend or enemy. But my grandmother taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing trust when fear says to hide. You chose to trust me, Jake said, understanding the weight of that choice. As you chose to help me, though every story your people tell about mine says I am savage, dangerous. She met his eyes across the fire. Perhaps we are both learning something today? Morning brought clarity. The storm had passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean and cool. The canyon below ran with muddy water, but had not flooded dangerously. Birds called in the cottonwoods, and somewhere distant, a hawk shrieked. Jake woke first, keeping the fire going. Nalin stirred shortly after, and for a moment they simply existed in the space they'd created. Provisional, temporary, but real. Your feet, Jake said, noticing again the cuts. I've got some cloth we can wrap them with. While Nalin tended to her feet, Jake scouted the area. The cattle trail was completely washed out, but he found something else. Fabric snagged on brush 50 yards away, sodden but intact. One of Nalin's garments, carried by the flood. He brought it back, averting his eyes. It's damaged, Nalin said, examining it, but I can work with it better than canvas. She looked at him squarely. You should return to your ranch. Tell them the trail is lost. I'll see you safely back first, Jake insisted. That would cause problems you have not considered. Nalin's voice was patient but firm. If my people see me arriving with a white cowboy, there will be questions, suspicions. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Jake wanted to argue but recognized the truth. The world they'd built here couldn't survive contact with the world below. That doesn't seem right, he said finally. Many things are not right, but that does not make them less real. Nalin stood, carrying herself with quiet dignity that Jake deeply respected. I know these canyons. I will be home before midday. They stood awkwardly, two people who had shared something profound, but had no framework for what came next. Thank you, Nalin said simply. You kept your word. That matters. You trusted a stranger. That took more courage than anything I did. Jake hesitated. If circumstances were different, but they are not. Nalin's smile was sad but genuine. Perhaps that is what we both learned, that different does not mean wrong, and that the stories we tell about each other are often lies. She gathered herself to leave, then turned back. The cattle you seek. Look west, toward the Mendez Ranch. I saw white men driving stock that way 3 days ago. You did not hear this from me. Before Jake could respond, she had slipped away into the canyon, moving like she'd been born from the sandstone itself. The ride back took Jake 2 days. He thought often about the encounter, about the fundamental decency he'd found in the last person his world expected him to trust. When he reported to Henderson, cattle trail lost to flooding, he didn't mention the Apache woman or the information she'd provided. But 3 days later, acting on what he told himself was just a hunch, he rode west toward the Mendez Ranch. There, poorly hidden in a back corral, he found Henderson's stolen cattle. The revelation that a neighboring white rancher was the thief surprised exactly no one except Henderson himself. Jake never saw Nayland again. But every time someone at the ranch spoke carelessly about Apache thieves or savages, he found himself pushing back, quietly insisting that maybe things weren't as simple as people assumed. He'd learned something in that canyon that would stay with him, that trust had to start somewhere, with someone, or the cycle of fear and violence would never break. Most importantly, he'd learned that the bedrock of human decency lay deeper than the divisions people created, and that recognizing another person's fundamental humanity cost nothing but changed everything.